Hello and welcome to AIL TV, and most importantly, welcome to Security Update. As always, our host is David Otto, but due to COVID-19, of course, we are following the rules of social distancing. Now, David, you are on.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to our guest. This is Africa Security Update. This is our third week, and we want to say a special thank you for all of you who have taken your time to follow up this program. We have a special program today to talk about misinformation, disinformation, and what is popularly called fake news. To do that, we have selected a number of special guests. Today we're having Selina Hayes, who's the CEO of Hayes Group International. She looks at cultural intelligence. She has expertise in security, disruptive technology, counterterrorism, and she's based in the United States. Selina has a huge experience understanding the new markets in Africa, and she will be shedding light on the impact of disinformation and fake news from a wider perspective. So we will hope you have a great time talking to Selina and listening to her, and ask your questions that you want to ask. Again, this is a very interactive, casual program, so please feel free to ask your questions when Selina comes on. We also have with us today Nordin Jose, who is a certified anti-terrorism specialist. Nordin also has a great experience in looking at how terrorist organizations use fake news, how they use propaganda to recruit, how they use propaganda to portray their ideology, also to undermine the counterterrorism efforts of states. So we would be having Nordin to speak a bit about his experience and how he sees African terrorist organizations using misinformation and propaganda to promote their cause. We'll also be having today on this program Tanwa Ashiru. Unfortunately, she's having some technical issues. She's based in Nigeria. Tanwa will look at the intelligence and the impact of misinformation within the intelligence industry. So as we said, this program, Africa Security Update, is specifically to look at the impact of security in Africa and to leverage our experience with other countries, with the United States, with Africa, and see how there can be genuine collaboration between African states. So most of the discussions that we are having on this platform is to create a lot of awareness, but also to showcase the links between African countries and European countries and the United States and other countries, in the Middle East, other continents in Asia. So this is a broad-based discussion, and we would hope to share in as much details as we can. Again, we always begin this program by talking about some of the hotspots that we have in Africa. Of course, Nigeria is one of them, where we have the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda faction Boko Haram and the Islamic State of West Africa Province. We've also got Ansaru in Nigeria. We've got other countries which are impacted by security issues like Cameroon in the far north. But they've also got in the southwest and the northwest regions where they've got Ambazonia separatists, clamoring for an independent state of Ambazonia. Within that context, we have Niger Republic, which borders Nigeria. We've also got Mali. We've got Chad. And then, of course, we have other countries like Somalia, where, Al-Shabaab has a great influence. Currently, there is a huge focus on the Liptako Goma again, which is the countries based in the Sahel. We have the Islamic State of the Greater Sahel operating within that region. We've also have a branch of Qaeda. So all these organizations, are influencing the narratives and the use of misinformation, disinformation, is one of the very powerful tools that these organizations use to progress. So we would be talking about these regions, but of course, we will talk broadly because again, you cannot talk about insecurity in Africa without linking that up to the Middle East. We shouldn't forget about Libya. We shouldn't forget about Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, all these countries that are seen as the kind of the origin, if I may say, of what we are experiencing today as modern day terrorism. So the discussions will be very casual again. I would have start with trying to give us a bit of an understanding of what is in fact fake news, and who are the people that use this fake news? Is it the government or is it non-state organizations, individuals as well? So she will give us a bit of that understanding before she can dive into what she has for us today. So Selena, thank you very much for joining us today from the United States. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me on your platform, and welcome to everyone that is listening in the US and on the continent. I have to say, I would normally be in Africa at this point, so I'm missing the travel and interacting with my friends in Africa. So I hope you're all doing well and hope you're all staying safe. So yes, David. You talk about fake news, and fake news is, I think, determined by who's receiving the messaging. Some may see it as fake, others see it as the truth. So it really depends on who's receiving the messaging. So the audience is the one that determines whether it's fake news or not. We're in this misinformation space. It's a new space. It has some boundaries, but they're not geographical boundaries as we traditionally know, nation states to have. So it's very dynamic. And if you look at our adversaries, they're using this space very well, and they actually have the advantage. There is no way that our adversaries, ISIS, Boko Haram, are going to be able to compete from a kinetic standpoint. So they're able to take this new space and using and influencing information to be able to gain the advantage. And again, as I mentioned, I think they've been very successful in being able to do this. That we see more from the CVE space, but we're also seeing misinformation, as you mentioned, David, from the near peer threat, from the Chinese and the Russians, in particular in Africa. And of course, you and I have delved into that, and we're seeing it in many, many different ways, to influence populations in Africa, to make influencing strategic decisions in business and in government decisions as well. I mean, even influencing upcoming elections. So it's a very powerful tool, and one that I think we all have to be aware of, and also implement counter strategies in how to stop and prevent some of these narratives from having the influence that they do.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about very good points, Selena. You spoke about the fake news being something which some people see it as fake and others see it as the truth. What I call the true lies. Is there instances where an information is factually true, but but it's still part of misinformation. I mean, what is that point in terms of where you would say people should watch out for? Because as you said, Africa is one of the weakest links because of the of the inability of most people to have access, to be able to determine whether an information is real or is not, and that often it has an impact on in their behaviors and the way that they carry out their actions. So how would you advise African countries to deal with this? You've got not just non-state actors like terrorist organizations using this, but you've also got states. How do they prevent this with the kind of infrastructures that you've seen in Africa?
Well, and that's a good question, and I think it's something that we're trying to get our hands around as we speak, because the information is passed so quickly these days. With a tweet, on Facebook, articles can be put out, fake articles. You can create a whole situation that didn't even happen, get a reaction to it, and like a story, and Africans are great at telling stories. The story may start off one way, and then a couple of days later it's something completely different. So it's in this space. It's very similar. I think governments in Africa have a responsibility to really doing fact checking and being very prompt and in countering the fake news. And then I also think that these social platforms have responsibility to stopping or prohibiting some of the fake news from spreading on their platforms. Those require policy. But just as individuals, I think it goes to our on ourselves to do fact checking as well, and to ensure that we're not spreading fake news ourselves, through these social platforms.
But that's correct. But you and I know that fake news is not just spread by non-state actors and individuals. Some governments are also responsible for spreading fake news. It's all about power and control. So how does this really? How can individuals prevent something like this? Look at, for example, the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are experiencing, and the level of misinformation that has spread, from so-called experts to government to well-respectable organizations. It seems as if we're just in between the table and the blue sea, I have to say.
Yeah, and you and I talked about the misinformation coming from China, and not only misinformation, just different messaging that created confusion around COVID. You're getting different types of messaging, and so the public did not know what to believe. I think as we move forward in this space, there are going to be some policies put in place, and maybe this comes from the UN on what is allowed and what is not allowed from state actors. Because as you and I again have discussed, especially with China in Africa, they've had significant influence on particular countries and the decisions that they've made moving forward.
That's right. But let me come to Nordine before I get back to you, Aspelina, because Nordine, you are a certified, anti-terrorism specialist, and you've spoken a lot about, the issue of terrorist recruitment. You've talked about radicalization and how terrorist organizations, have mastered, the technique of using fake news and propaganda to recruit very vulnerable people, to undermine state authorities, but also to launch attacks, against government institutions, by using propaganda videos. Now, you and I know that human beings, rely on options. And, where one option seems to be a lot more powerful in terms of, its content and context, the most vulnerable people will be much more drawn into that. And this is what, you've spoken about, you've talked about it, how it leads to, radicalization. Now, I mean, in the context of Africa, how do you see this manifesting? As Selena said, there is very little, infrastructural capability that Africans have to determine what is real and what is fake, especially from an organization that, promises a lot of things. How do you see this, in your experience, Nordin?
Unfortunately, African countries don't have the capacity to counter the jihadist narrative like the Western countries have it. Like, for example, there's a company called Moonshoot in the UK that specializes in disrupting far-right narratives online and jihadist narratives. But in Africa, we don't have this luxury of having such companies which can disrupt the narrative being put out by terrorist organizations, whether it's in Nigeria, with ISIS or other parts of Africa. So unfortunately, that's a gaping weakness that we have. And so terrorist groups are having a free reign in that aspect. And I think there has to be, African countries have to be helped to develop this capacity to basically have strong counter-narrative strategies in place. Because some people cannot, how do you say, they cannot differentiate between fact and fiction because there's so much conspiracies out there. And I've actually been asking this question in the last few weeks and months. I've been asking how many people have been radicalized because of the current lockdown. It doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in Europe, Africa, or America. And because there's been so many conspiracy theories out there, whether it's the far right, whether it's jihadists. And so this is something to keep an eye on in the coming months.
Yeah.
How many people are going to act on these intentions? And in Africa, I think it's a very relevant issue because, you have all these conspiracy theories and jihadist groups basically have gone full force in terms of trying to promote the conspiracy theories, trying to target their messaging at young, vulnerable people.
Yeah.
Who don't have they haven't been empowered to differentiate truth from fiction.
Yes.
And so chances are some people are going to be radicalized. The question is quantifying to what extent or how many people, what part of the population have been radicalized, and then acting on those intentions.
I think you've made a very good point. But as you know, in Africa, when we talk about areas like Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Far North Province, all these countries don't have the same kind of establishment in terms of connections. So what we find is that the method of misinformation is the same because a lot of them don't radicalize online. They are radicalized because they are poor, and they give them alternatives. So this is another form of misinformation because they tell them one thing, but actually it's another thing. So how do you see a scenario where, for example, Moonshoot deals with online de-radicalization? How do you deal with misinformation established online? Isn't this where you have states local organizations instead of going online like Moonshoot does?
Well, I think there was a recent kind of leaflet about Boko Haram. I think ISWAP. They were spreading leaflets around propaganda, basically.
Yes.
In parts of Nigeria, the northern parts of Nigeria, about not helping the government and if they did help the government, then they'd be killed. So there has been that capacity on the ground by the NGOs and governments basically to stop that those leaflets being handed out. It's also a form of propaganda narrative basically. So and obviously that's what's frustrating about African countries. There isn't a counter narrative apparatus in place
Okay.
to stop this something simple as a pamphlet being handed out, because it spreads fear in the community, and the community cannot fight back because they're afraid.
Yes.
So they're kind of caught in a catch-22 now, where they want to live a peaceful life, but they're being threatened on one side by the jihadist groups. At the same time, the government is not offering a robust response to counter these narratives, basically. Because in Africa, we don't have our extensive IT infrastructure, internet infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So obviously, the delivery of these conspiracy theories will come in a different form, whether it's pamphlets, whether it's over radio waves. It could be also simple text messaging.
Yes.
So there's different strategies that jihadist groups employ depending on the resources at their disposal.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point. Let me come to Selena. Now, what is very clear, Selena, you and I have talked about this. The COVID-19 pandemic, it's not just a health issue. It's also a misinformation pandemic. Are we on the same page on this?
Well, let me just go back. I just want to go back to something that your other guest just mentioned. When people receive messages differently. You receive a message differently to how I receive a message. In order to counter fake news, you really have to get ahead of it and work out, like in Nigeria, for instance, how are those people best receiving messaging, and then what do they best react to, and then also what platform is the best way of receiving messaging, if it's through pamphlets or if it's through radio. You have to find what they best react to. We know in Rwanda, 800,000 people died through a radio program, that was spewing out propaganda of fake news. 3 weeks later, you had 800,000 Rwandans dead from just fake news through a radio program. So we can see how powerful that is. The success of that program was that they worked out what their recipients wanted to hear. And so I think encountering, say, Boko Haram with the leaflets, you then have to work out what are the positive messages, what are the other messages that the population want to receive and how they want to receive it. And that's what I don't think we focus on enough. Mm-hmm. We tend to send out messaging and make an assumption that the recipient is going to receive the same message that we think that we're sending out. Yeah. And that's what's happening with COVID as well. And it could be with all the great intentions, but if the recipient doesn't receive the message in the right way, it's essentially a lost cause at that point. So there's some nuances that we have to consider when we're looking at sending out messaging and information in order for it to be successful.
And talking about that, Nordine mentioned a very important point that you have organizations that are dealing specifically with counter messaging, disruptive, technology or disinformation, fake news. Do you think it's time for government departments to be established to specifically deal with fake news? In the era of wild technology, I call it.
I think it is time. I think in countries like Nigeria that have a very robust tech center, I think can lead the way in Africa and bringing in some of this disruptive tech, through government channels and push back through a counter narrative strategy to some of this fake news. I think it's time that happens. As we've all pointed out, Nigeria, Africa as a whole has some gaps and vulnerabilities from a technology standpoint. But I think those gaps can be quickly overcome, and I think in this information age, counter narrative disruptive tech is needed.
Okay, Nadine, let me jump to you because I think this is quite important for us to have this chat. The collapse of the Islamic State, of the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Mosul, gave room for the reinforcement of the ISIS caliphate, in the Lake Chad Basin, which is in Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger, Chad, but also, it's giving, an upsurge in ISIS activities in the Sahel, which is, some people call this area the Liptako Goma, which is, the triangle between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. You've got, the U.S. presence there. You've also got the presence of the French, in various operations within that area. Now there is this concern that you will have terrorist organizations that are no longer capable of holding grounds in areas like Syria and Iraq, moving towards Africa. How do you see the influence of disinformation or misinformation from this perspective? Are these is this kind of trajectory being made possible by what ISIS proclaims itself to be, and these other countries in Africa are trying to pick that up? Is that what you see in your experience?
Yeah, well, it's still an evolving situation. It's a difficult question to ask. Well, I'm still assessing the current trend. I'd have to get back to you. So I wouldn't commit myself right now because I'm a bit, how do I say? I would say I'm still assessing the current impact
of that.
Of the influx of foreign fighters from Syria and Iraq.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I'm asking this is because currently what I've seen is that I'm sure you've seen that too, where Boko Haram will carry out an attack in an area in Nigeria, and they will quickly upload a propaganda video, and they would send that video to the Islamic State to demonstrate to the Islamic State that they are a force to reckon with in Africa. So this for me sounds more like a misinformation tactics between terrorist organizations, not necessarily for the state, but to show their counterparts that they are doing well. I mean, do you see that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a marketing tool. If I can use a crude example, because you want like now ISWAP wants support funding.
Yeah.
You could have a string of successful attacks, and then create a propaganda video to try and attract more followers and more funding from different parts of the world, including the Middle East.
Yeah.
So yes, it is an effective and cheap way of kind of getting out your message that you're having an impact, your cause to be supported, and people should get behind you. So and I'm seeing that now with the current offensive by the Nigerian military and the regional joint task force in northern part of Nigeria, where they like now they killed the ISIS commander in Nigeria.
Yes.
But then ISWAP will try and carry out an attack and then create a propaganda video, partly to taunt the government and then the military, at the same time to keep recruiting more people, keep the terror financing coming in.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, let me get to Selena because I'm sure that she would have a good idea on this. Um, you know,
I hope so.
when, yeah, so when the Islamic State of West Africa province puts up a video on YouTube or any other channel, there is a lot of advocates that the responsibility lies with the platform owners, Facebook, YouTube, to take this down. How does that impact on that information itself? Is it because it's not going to spread to the rest of the world, or is it because what they are doing is not happening?
So it's human nature. Yes, there's some graphic material out there which should be, not everyone should see. But, as soon as, say, Facebook or YouTube say, I'm going to take this down, then, of course, everyone goes out to look for it. And then just that narrative alone, that's a narrative in itself, tends to spread the information more. So sometimes maybe it's a strategy not to place any type of focus on those videos, to ignore them, because then they're less likely to spread to others and be used as a recruiting tool. But there has been more action on the part of the platforms to pull down some of the propaganda material that's been released, not only in Africa, I mean around the world. You're seeing it here in the US as well, where the Twitter platform is starting to categorize fake news being released out onto that platform as an attempt to alert the consumers of this information that the fact that the information in these tweets or videos is not the truth.
And Selena, before let me also come to this point, because while we're there, we're talking about this. We have seen during this COVID-19 pandemic a scenario where one set of experts, will say this works, and another group of experts would say it doesn't work. For every good argument that has been put forward, or every good, measure that has been put forward in terms of prevention for COVID-19, or social distancing strategic measures, there has been a very good argument against that by other experts. And this has subsequently led to some countries, including the United States, saying we are pulling away our funding, from the to the World Health Organization. Is this part of misinformation? Are we experiencing misinformation from experts, or is ignorance? What is this? I mean, how would you describe what is going on?
Well, if you look at this in the bigger picture, I think you're looking at how information is being used and attached to a much larger agenda. So, I don't think it's by accident that suddenly, the US says, oh, okay, we're not going to fund, the World Health Organization. It could be argued that was, there was some anticipation of that occurring even before COVID. COVID just gave the vehicle to be able for this to occur. And just within the US strategy right now, more of a bilateral type of strategy is occurring, with different countries, rather than looking at it, from a global multinational type treaties. Tends to be more like bilateral agreements now. So information, I think, is being used by not only the US, but other countries within the COVID context to enhance their own policies, maybe from a foreign foreign policy, or from whatever they're trying to gain a strategic advantage. I think the Chinese have done that very well in Africa around COVID. Or they attempted to, but I think other countries are doing the same thing. They also have been restricting information around COVID, and that has also created confusion as well. And I think when the populations live in a state of confusion, that just creates even more misinformation. Because then you start questioning what is fact and what is fiction. As you pointed out, you're getting all these different experts, different strategies around COVID. What medications to take. Do you wear a mask or do you not wear a mask?
Yeah.
So it's that is part of the strategy of those that employ a misinformation campaign, is to create a state of chaos.
Yeah, and do you think within the same line of thought, do you think this kind of a dichotomy of what to believe and not to believe from very credible looking experts, experts, do you think it has impacted on the social contract that ordinary citizens had with the state, in terms of reliance on in situations like this? How do you see that impacting in the nearest future on what people believe in? So, in the era of misinformation, who do you really choose to be the one to believe in if you can't believe in the state or in experts?
Yeah, and that creates, that creates an air of distrust, not only between the government and the citizen, but between each other. And those that are some of our adversaries use that division very successfully, again, to create that state of chaos and create those divisions, maybe between different countries or different groups of people, different races, and again, it goes to that state of confusion where they can gain the advantage to whatever their agenda is.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Selena. And Nordin, let me come to you. You and I have talked a lot about the terror triangle, and the key to the terror triangle, of course, the terror triangle has the three dimensions of motivation, why people join terrorist organizations, how they acquire their capabilities and capacities, but also how they, target, people or critical infrastructure. But the area where misinformation and disinformation really features, as we said before, is how they recruit, but also how they pump out information in terms of their successes. Now, you've got a bit of experience, looking at, some of the current events, that are happening within, the European setting. So, do you see misinformation from terrorist organizations as something which, we can deal with, or have we lost the plot?
I think it's having the capacity basically to offer counter narrative, and it's just that's also lacking, like in African countries basically. Are we being outmaneuvered? I think we are in certain extents, basically. Like I said, in the European countries have a robust counterterrorism strategy, whether it's intelligence gathering, whether it's the police. And like I said, I refer to Moonshoot as a company that specializes in online counter-narrative strategies. So in Africa, we don't have that capacity, and basically African countries are losing that battle. Mm-hmm. And so the terrorist groups are very smart. They're very effective at how they're using the strategy, but they're good at identifying a particular population and their vulnerabilities now. That way they can tailor the narrative to those people's vulnerabilities now. So depending on whether they're men or women, what are their needs, what are their cultural backgrounds. So I think the governments have to ramp up their efforts in outsmarting the terrorist groups in this respect.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that's a very good point. Let's looking towards concluding. But of course, I would like us to look at the way forward. I mean, Selena, you interact with a lot of stakeholders, authorities. You've done it all. What keeps them awake at night? And what should we be expecting in the fake news and misinformation era? Are we on the last lap, or have we still got a long time to run?
No, I'm always the optimist. So as I mentioned previously, I think in particular Nigeria, with it being the robust tech center that it is, that I think there's a great opportunity for us to get ahead of these counter narrative, to be able to counter narratives. As I mentioned at the beginning, and we all three of us have talked about this. Our enemy is very good at operating in this space, and they definitely have an advantage right now. We need to have a better understanding of who it is we're trying to influence.
Yeah.
And again, how they receive messaging, and that's what our adversaries are very good at. They're very good at recruiting. They're very good at understanding what young people want to hear. They understand the differences between men and women, that there's a gender component here, that women receive messages different to how men do. So I think we need to get more proactive around messaging and around narratives, and really take this new battle space seriously, and start instituting some real strategies around it. I think now it's kind of a hit or miss type of approach. We try things out, we'll see if that works. It doesn't work. I think we need to get more proactive in this space.
Yeah, but what are the challenges that you've experienced? I mean, what are the challenges that you see? I mean, somebody's going to ask you, why are we not doing it? Is it that we don't know how to do what our opponents are doing, or don't we have the resources to do it? We don't have the know-how. I mean, why are we not doing it?
Well, I think, of course, a lot of it is money. I think also, too, there's a generational gap here.
That's a good point.
Technology has moved very quickly. I actually call it the 2Gs, gender and generational. And you've got a lot of, in Africa, having 70% of the population is under the age of 25 or something. I don't quote me on those. Yeah. So you've got young people using new technologies that in those that are forming policy, maybe don't even know how to operate on those platforms, not even aware of them. So there's a generational gap there that I think that we need to kind of close, and start engaging maybe some different voices within this space, and get some new ideas on how to counter some of these narratives.
Nordine, do you see the same generational gap in the CVE, PVE space? Do you see that the people that have been radicalized are the younger people? As Selena said, of course, Africa has a 75% of young people below the age of 25, which is a massive population. They are the problem, if I want to call it that. Most of the African leaders, the people that are in power, are 2 generations behind, and they are expected to provide these solutions. Do you see that as a main challenge? that, the problem is with the youth, the solution is with the older generation that, has a minimized knowledge on technology?
Yeah, I mean, like for example, I made a post about a young man at 14. He has been arrested for terrorist offenses, and I was asking the question, did the prevent program fail in this regard? Could this person have been saved? He's only 14 years of age, so the terrorist groups are targeting young people at an even younger age. If it's at 14, then how young will the next person be in Africa strapping on explosive device? So, the younger the better, because that means that the young person can be molded into what the terrorist group wants. So I think it's a collaborative effort between the younger generation and the more elder leadership in Africa, because the young people are the future leaders, and so the current leadership in Africa and have to be basically educate themselves about the current techniques of misinformation and counter narratives.
Thank you very much, both of you. Again, this is a very wealth of knowledge, from both of you, because as you know, in the era of COVID-19, in an era where incidents have become the norm of the day, in Africa, as you have said, the critical thing is, how do you know what is misinformation? How do you spot fake news? I mean, that's a great challenge. And you've talked about detail. Of course, understanding behind fake news is very important, because it will give you, a great understanding as to the underlying impact and the measured mission of that particular news. But one critical thing which you guys have really done is, how do you deal with fake news? Who is responsible for dealing with fake news, and who has the capacity or somehow the energy to do it? So I hope that this discussion about information and disinformation from both of you, would lead to some things, at least within the African context. So that our generation and the generation before us, generation before that, begin to see how they can synergize in with the various threats from inside African countries, threats from within, and threats from without. So thank you very much, Selina Hayes. You've been wonderful. Again, just to remind the audience, Selina Hayes, she's the CEO of Hayes Group International. She has a great deal of expertise in cultural intelligence, disruptive technology, security, and counterterrorism, and she spends most of her time in Africa. We would hope to, catch up again, Selina, before you travel to Africa. Nordin, you are, we talk all the time, and you've, shown your expertise, in various ways. Thank you so much for, giving this program your time. We really want to appreciate African TV in London. We want to appreciate Mr. Joseph. But the most important goes to the audience out there. They've taken their time to follow up this program. We will have this program live. Well, not live. We will have it on Facebook again. You can tweet anytime. You can send your questions. We would be able to answer. You can also tweet, and we would share our Twitter handle. Selina, what is your Twitter handle? Let's share that to the audience.
On Twitter?
Yeah.
It's Sassy Hayes.
Okay, at Sassy Hayes. And Nordin?
It's Mosey, at Mosey Nordin.
Thank you very much. So we hope the audience is, has been able to get that. Thank you very much, Selina. Thank you very much, Nordin. We wish you all the best, and we will see you again very soon.
Thank you, David.
So let's have Mr. Joseph.